Sometimes the smallest message carries the weight of an entire lifetime. My phone vibrated at exactly 3:17 a.m., dragging me out of a shallow sleep that had become all too familiar over the past 5 years. The room around me was silent except for the steady hum of the old refrigerator in my tiny apartment and the distant rumble of trucks rolling down Interstate 84. I reached toward the nightstand with half-closed eyes, expecting another spam notification or an automated reminder from the bakery where I worked before sunrise every morning. Instead, I found a text from an unknown number. There were only 3 words. He knows everything. I stared at the screen until the brightness burned into my vision. My heart didn't race. It simply stopped for one impossible second before beginning again with slow, heavy beats that echoed through my chest. No greeting. No explanation. No name. Just those 3 words sitting quietly against a black screen as though they had always been waiting for me. I checked the sender again. No contact. No location. Nothing that could explain why someone would send me a message like that after all these years. My thumb hovered above the keyboard, but every reply, I imagined, felt wrong. Who is this? What do you mean? You have the wrong number. None of them seemed safe. I locked the phone and placed it face down on the nightstand, convincing myself it had to be a mistake. Yet sleep refused to return. By 4:30, I was already dressed, tying my apron inside the employee entrance of Willow Creek Bakery while the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls slowly filled the kitchen. The familiar routine usually settled my nerves. Measure the flour. Warm the milk. Mix the dough. Slide trays into the ovens. Smile at the regular customers who arrived before work. It was a simple life, carefully built one ordinary morning at a time. That's exactly why I had chosen it. Quiet places asked fewer questions. Quiet people remembered fewer faces. Quiet lives buried old mistakes beneath years of predictable routines. At 7 o'clock sharp, the front bell chimed for the first customer of the morning. I looked up automatically, already preparing my usual greeting. But the words caught in my throat. Alexander Knight stepped inside wearing a charcoal overcoat dusted with tiny drops of spring rain. 5 years had changed almost everything about me, yet somehow nothing about him seemed different. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his posture perfectly composed, and his calm gray eyes scanned the display case without ever landing on me for more than a second. To him, I was only another employee behind another counter. To me, he was the last person I had ever expected to see again. He ordered a large black coffee and a plain croissant with the same polite voice I remembered from another lifetime. I forced my hands to stay steady while preparing his order, repeating every movement exactly as I had practiced thousands of times before. He thanked me with a courteous nod, picked up his breakfast, and walked toward the window seat overlooking the quiet street. Then my phone vibrated again. Another message from the same unknown number appeared before my eyes. Don't let him leave. Alexander remained by the window, stirring a cup of black coffee he had not yet tasted while rain traced thin silver lines across the glass. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the street as though he was waiting for someone who had never arrived. I tried to focus on work instead of him. Fresh blueberry muffins came out of the oven. Mrs. Carter asked for her usual sourdough loaf. A construction crew ordered 6 breakfast sandwiches before heading to a job site across town. The ordinary rhythm of the bakery continued exactly as it had every morning for years, but my thoughts refused to stay inside the present. My phone felt heavier in the pocket of my apron than a brick. I told myself not to look. I lasted less than 2 minutes. The screen was still glowing with the last message. Do not let him leave. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Whoever had sent those words knew where I was. They knew Alexander was sitting only 20 feet away. That was impossible. I had built this life carefully after disappearing from the city. I had changed apartments twice before settling in Willow Creek. I had never used my old address, never contacted anyone from my former life, and never searched Alexander's name online, no matter how many sleepless nights I had been tempted to do exactly that. I had survived by becoming forgettable. Yet someone had found me anyway. My coworker Emily nudged my shoulder with a friendly smile. Everything all right, Ethan? You look like you have seen a ghost. I forced a laugh that sounded unfamiliar even to me. Just did not sleep much. She accepted the answer without another question and returned to arranging pastries in the display case. I envied how simple life still seemed for everyone else inside these walls. My attention drifted back toward Alexander. He had removed his coat and placed it neatly over the back of the chair. His sleeves were rolled up just enough to reveal a silver watch that caught the morning light. He opened a leather notebook instead of checking his phone, writing a few careful lines before stopping as though whatever he wanted to say no longer belonged on the page. There was something unexpectedly lonely about him. 5 years ago, I had believed loneliness was the one thing we quietly shared. That belief had changed everything. The memory arrived without warning. A rooftop overlooking downtown Portland. Cold spring air carrying the smell of rain. A quiet conversation that lasted far longer than either of us expected. A promise that had never actually been spoken aloud. I blinked hard, forcing myself back into the present before the rest of the memory could surface. The front door opened again, letting in another customer, and a cool breeze swept across the bakery. Alexander looked toward the entrance for only a second before returning his attention to the notebook. Then my phone vibrated for the third time. I opened the message almost against my own will. This one was longer. He still carries the photograph. Ask him about the lighthouse. I stared at the words until they blurred together. There had only ever been one photograph, and only 2 people in the world had known where it was taken. I slowly lifted my eyes toward Alexander just as he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully pulled out a faded photograph that he quietly placed on the table in front of him. My legs refused to move for several long seconds as I watched Alexander study the faded photograph resting between his untouched coffee and the rain-speckled window. The edges were worn white from years of careful handling, and even from behind the counter I recognized the weathered wooden lighthouse standing against an endless gray ocean. My breath caught in my throat. There had never been another copy. I remembered the cold wind that afternoon on the Oregon coast, the cries of gulls circling overhead, and the old tourist who had smiled before offering to take our picture with a disposable camera because he insisted memories looked better when someone else captured them. I had laughed at the idea. Alexander had almost refused. Somehow we had both ended up standing in front of the lighthouse anyway, awkwardly close together, pretending we were simply 2 strangers enjoying the same view. It was the only photograph we had ever taken together. I had believed it disappeared forever the day I walked away. My phone vibrated once more, almost making me drop the tray I was carrying. I looked down carefully, shielding the screen from anyone nearby. The next message appeared instantly. He has looked at that picture every Thursday for 5 years. The words settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. Every Thursday. I glanced toward the calendar hanging beside the kitchen door. Thursday. That could not be coincidence. Someone was watching both of us with impossible precision. Emily called my name from behind the espresso machine, asking if I could bring another pot of coffee to the dining area. I nodded automatically, grateful for an excuse to step closer without drawing attention. My hands remained steady, even though every heartbeat felt louder than the bakery itself. I stopped beside Alexander's table and gently placed the fresh coffee pot next to his cup. "Would you like a refill, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and professional. He looked up, and for the first time our eyes truly met. There was no spark of recognition, no sudden realization, only quiet courtesy mixed with unmistakable exhaustion. "Thank you," he said, softly. "That would be nice." I poured the coffee slowly, trying not to glance at the photograph, but curiosity won. The image had faded enough that our younger faces were difficult to distinguish, softened by time and sunlight. Anyone else would have seen 2 ordinary figures standing near a lighthouse. Only I knew what had happened after the picture was taken. Alexander noticed my eyes lingering on it for a brief second. Instead of hiding it, he surprised me by offering a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "Strange to keep carrying something this old, is not it?" he asked. I forced myself to shake my head. Some memories are worth keeping. His expression changed in a way I could not explain. He looked back at the photograph before speaking again. "I have spent years trying to remember the name of the person standing beside me. I lost part of my memory after an accident a long time ago. Everyone says if I cannot remember by now, I probably never will." My fingers tightened around the coffee pot. Accident. Memory. 5 years. The pieces no longer fit the story I had spent years believing. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated again. I looked at the screen beneath the counter. The final message of the morning contained only one sentence. "He never forgot you. He only forgot himself." The words on my screen refused to disappear even after I locked the phone and slipped it back into my apron pocket. He never forgot you. He only forgot himself. I repeated the sentence silently while wiping a perfectly clean table simply to keep my hands occupied. It explained nothing, yet somehow it changed everything. For years I had carried the quiet certainty that Alexander had chosen to erase me from his life. That belief had become the foundation of every decision I made afterward. Now, with a single message from an invisible stranger, the ground beneath that foundation had begun to crack. Alexander folded the faded photograph with remarkable care before sliding it back inside his notebook instead of returning it to his coat. It was a small gesture, almost protective, as though the memory itself had become too fragile to expose for long. He remained seated by the window while the bakery gradually filled with the familiar sounds of morning conversations, clinking coffee cups, and laughter from customers greeting neighbors before work. Yet he seemed completely separate from all of it, sitting quietly inside a world only he could see. Around 9 o'clock, another man entered the bakery wearing a navy business suit that looked expensive enough to attract attention anywhere else. Here in Willow Creek, however, it only made him appear out of place. He spotted Alexander immediately and walked over with the relaxed confidence of someone who had known him for years. I carried another tray of pastries toward the display case, staying close enough to hear fragments of their conversation without appearing interested. "You skipped breakfast again yesterday," the man said with a tired smile. "Your assistant is convinced this bakery is the only place where you actually eat." Alexander gave a quiet laugh that sounded surprisingly genuine. "The coffee is better here. Or maybe you keep hoping something else comes back." Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the rain outside before speaking softly. "Every week I wake up believing this will finally be the Thursday when I remember why that lighthouse matters." The man sighed. "Dr. Bennett says memory is unpredictable. You cannot force it." "I am not trying to force it anymore," Alexander replied. "I just cannot convince myself to stop looking." Those words lingered with me long after the conversation drifted to business schedules and meetings in Portland. He was still searching, not for a company, not for success, but for a missing piece of himself. Emily leaned beside me while wrapping fresh cookies in paper bags. "That customer comes here every Thursday," she whispered. "Always sits in the same chair. Always orders the same breakfast. It is almost like a tradition." I managed a small nod, pretending the information was new. She continued with the easy curiosity of someone who enjoyed local gossip. "Mrs. Dawson said he bought the old Harbor View cottage last year, even though he only visits once a week. Nobody knows why." Harbor View. My chest tightened. The cottage overlooked the same stretch of coastline where the lighthouse stood. He had chosen to stay near the place neither of us had ever truly left behind. Before I could gather my thoughts, the bell above the bakery door chimed as another customer entered. This time it was an elderly mail carrier holding a small express envelope. He looked around the room until his eyes settled on me. "Package for Ethan Brooks," he called. Confused, I stepped forward and accepted the envelope. There was no return address, only my name written in careful black ink. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it behind the counter. Inside was a single folded map of the Oregon coast. One location had been circled in red: the abandoned lighthouse. Beneath it, someone had written 6 simple words: "Come before he remembers everything." I slipped the folded map back into the envelope before anyone could notice my shaking hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, almost elegant, yet every word carried the weight of someone who knew far more about my past than they should. "Come before he remembers everything." I repeated the sentence silently, as if saying it enough times would reveal its hidden meaning. Remember everything. Until that morning, I had believed Alexander had simply chosen another path. Now I had learned he had lost years of his memory instead. If that was true, then what else had I misunderstood? The bakery slowly emptied as the breakfast rush faded into the quiet rhythm of late morning. Emily began cleaning the display cases while soft jazz drifted through the speakers overhead. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath pale sunlight. Everything looked peaceful. Everything felt ordinary. Yet my entire world had begun shifting beneath my feet. I looked toward the window. Alexander was still there, staring absent-mindedly at the notebook resting beside his coffee. His friend had already left for Portland after reminding him about an afternoon meeting, but Alexander showed no sign of following. Instead, He seemed trapped inside his own thoughts, searching for answers that refused to come. Without warning, another memory surfaced. 5 years earlier, we had driven north along Highway 101 with every window rolled down because the air smelled like salt and pine trees after the rain. Alexander had insisted on taking the scenic route, even though it added nearly an hour to the trip. He said beautiful places deserved extra time. We had laughed over terrible gas station coffee, argued playfully about directions, and stopped at roadside overlooks simply because the view was too incredible to ignore. Neither of us had realized that day would become the last happy memory we would ever share together. I forced the memory away before it could reveal what came afterward. Some doors remained closed for a reason. My phone stayed silent for almost an hour. The silence itself became unsettling. Whoever had been guiding me through the morning had suddenly disappeared, leaving only unanswered questions behind. I considered deleting every message, throwing away the map, and pretending none of this had happened. I had rebuilt my life once. Perhaps I could protect it again by refusing to look backward. Then Alexander stood from his chair. He gathered his notebook, slipped the faded photograph inside, and reached for his coat. My heart tightened. If he walked out now, I did not know when I would ever see him again. I took one instinctive step forward before stopping myself. What could I possibly say? Hello, we knew each other years ago. You forgot me, but I never forgot you. None of it sounded real. As Alexander approached the register to pay, our eyes met once more. This time he hesitated. It lasted only a second, but I saw something flicker across his face. Confusion, recognition, or perhaps only curiosity. He looked at me as though he were listening to a distant melody he almost remembered but could not quite place. Have we met before? He asked quietly. The question struck harder than I expected. Every answer seemed dangerous. Every silence seemed dishonest. Before I could speak, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, apologized politely, and answered the call while walking toward the entrance. I caught only a few words before the door closed behind him. Yes, I understand. The lighthouse. He froze on the sidewalk, slowly turning toward the distant coastline beyond the town, as though the single word had awakened something buried deep inside his mind. The moment the bakery door closed behind Alexander, the silence inside felt unnatural, as though the entire room had paused to listen for something only I could hear. I watched through the front window as he remained standing on the sidewalk with his phone still pressed against his ear. His expression shifted from quiet curiosity to unmistakable confusion. He looked toward the distant coastline, then down at the photograph he had taken from his notebook once again. Even from across the street, I could see his thumb tracing the faded edge of the picture as though it might unlock a memory hidden beneath the worn paper. A delivery truck rolled between us, blocking my view for only a few seconds. When it passed, Alexander was gone. My heart sank. I rushed outside before I could stop myself, scanning both directions along the quiet main street. There was no sign of him, only the fading sound of a car pulling away toward the highway. Emily stepped into the doorway behind me with a puzzled expression. "Everything all right?" she asked. I forced a smile that fooled neither of us. I thought someone dropped something. She nodded slowly before returning inside, wisely deciding not to ask another question. I remained on the sidewalk for another minute, staring toward the road leading west. That highway eventually reached the coast. It also led to the abandoned lighthouse marked on the mysterious map folded inside my pocket. Back inside the bakery, I finished the remainder of my shift almost entirely by instinct. Customers came and went. Receipts printed. Coffee brewed. Conversations drifted around me without meaning. Every ordinary task felt strangely distant, as though someone else was living my routine while my thoughts raced somewhere far beyond Willow Creek. Shortly after noon, my phone vibrated again. There was no notification sound this time, only a single message appearing on the screen. He is remembering faster than expected. Do not let him arrive alone. I stared at the words until they blurred together. Faster than expected. Whoever was sending these messages was not guessing. They were monitoring events as they unfolded. I typed my first reply of the day. "Who are you?" The message showed as delivered. No answer came. Instead, another photograph appeared a few seconds later. It showed the lighthouse from above, taken recently by what looked like a drone. A silver SUV was parked beside the abandoned access road. The license plate was impossible to read, but I recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to Alexander. My pulse quickened. He had already started driving there. I hurried into the employee break room and unfolded the paper map once more. The red circle surrounded more than the lighthouse itself. A narrow hiking trail extended behind the cliffs toward an overlook that had never appeared on tourist brochures. I remembered that trail. 5 years earlier, Alexander had insisted we follow it because he believed the best views were always the ones that required extra effort. We had reached a weathered wooden bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean just before sunset. Someone had carved a simple sentence into the wood years before we arrived. Some promises wait longer than people do. I had forgotten those words until this very moment. A sudden realization settled over me with startling clarity. The mysterious messages had never tried to frighten me. They had been leading me somewhere from the very beginning. And if Alexander was already on his way to the lighthouse, then whatever truth had remained hidden for 5 years was about to surface whether either of us was ready or not. I left the bakery 15 minutes earlier than usual, telling Emily there was a family emergency. The lie came easily, but the weight behind it felt painfully real. My apartment was only 6 blocks away, yet every traffic light seemed determined to slow me down. Inside, I changed into a heavier jacket, grabbed my car keys, and unfolded the worn map one final time across the kitchen table. The red circle around the abandoned lighthouse looked almost like a warning now instead of an invitation. I traced the narrow trail leading to the overlook with my fingertip, remembering details I had spent years forcing myself to forget. The old wooden bench, the sound of waves striking the cliffs below, the constant wind that carried the smell of salt through every season. Those memories no longer felt distant. They felt unfinished. Before leaving, I checked my phone once more. No new messages. The silence unsettled me more than the endless stream of mysterious instructions had. Whoever had been guiding me throughout the day seemed content to let the next chapter unfold without interference. I started the engine and pointed the car west toward the Pacific Coast Highway. The farther I drove, the more familiar the landscape became. Dense evergreens lined the winding road, broken every few miles by sweeping views of the ocean stretching endlessly beneath a cloudy afternoon sky. 5 years had changed the towns, the roadside businesses, and even some of the highway exits, yet the coastline itself remained exactly as I remembered. Beautiful, patient, unchanged by the lives passing through it. Nearly 2 hours later, I turned onto the narrow gravel access road leading toward the abandoned lighthouse. My tires crunched over loose stones as the old tower slowly appeared above the cliffs. Time had weathered its white paint into soft shades of gray, but it still stood proudly against the horizon. My heart pounded the moment I spotted a familiar silver SUV parked near the rusted gate exactly where the anonymous photograph had shown it. Alexander had already arrived. I stepped out into the cool ocean breeze and listened. There were only waves, gulls, and the distant cry of a foghorn somewhere beyond the rocks. The place felt empty, yet not abandoned. Someone had been here recently. Fresh footprints crossed the damp ground toward the narrow hiking trail behind the lighthouse. I followed them carefully, each step pulling another forgotten memory to the surface. I remembered Alexander laughing because I complained about the steep climb. I remembered stopping halfway to catch my breath while he insisted the view would be worth it. Most of all, I remembered how peaceful everything had felt before our lives changed forever. The trail curved around the cliff before opening onto the overlook exactly as I remembered. The weathered wooden bench still faced the endless Pacific Ocean, its faded carving barely visible beneath years of wind and rain. Someone was already standing there with his back toward me. Alexander remained perfectly still, holding the old photograph in one hand while staring at the horizon as though searching for an answer hidden somewhere beyond the water. I took one cautious step forward. The gravel shifted beneath my shoe. He slowly turned around. This time there was no uncertainty in his eyes. There was only quiet recognition mixed with disbelief. His lips parted before he spoke a name that he had been unable to remember only hours earlier. Ethan. Alexander spoke my name so quietly that the wind nearly carried it away before I could believe I had actually heard it. For 5 years I had imagined dozens of impossible reunions, yet none of them had looked like this. There was no certainty in his expression, only astonishment, relief, and the unmistakable feeling that a missing piece of his life had suddenly returned. Neither of us moved. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly behind him while waves crashed against the cliffs below, steady and unchanged, as though time itself had been patiently waiting for this moment. "You remember," I whispered before I could stop myself. Alexander slowly shook his head. "Not everything," he admitted. "Only fragments. Your face, your voice, this place. They all came back at once the moment I stepped onto this trail." He looked down at the faded photograph still resting in his hand. "I spent years believing this picture was trying to tell me something. I just never understood what." I felt the folded map inside my jacket pocket pressing against my chest like another heartbeat. "I thought you left because you wanted to forget me," I said quietly. His eyes widened with genuine surprise. "Forget you." He repeated the words as though they belonged to someone else's story. "Ethan, I spent every Thursday searching for someone I could not even remember. Everyone kept telling me to let it go because memory does not always return. I could never explain why I refused." A long silence settled between us, filled only by the distant cries of seabirds circling above the lighthouse. Then my phone vibrated once again. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet air. I hesitated before taking it from my pocket. Another anonymous message waited on the screen. "Good. Now ask him about the letter." I looked up slowly. "Alexander," I said, "did you ever receive a letter from me?" Confusion crossed his face almost immediately. "No." The answer came without hesitation. I waited for one, but it never arrived. My pulse quickened. "I wrote 3. He stared at me in complete disbelief. "I answered every one," he said softly. 3 letters. 1 every month." We both fell silent again as the impossible truth settled between us. I had never received his replies. He had never received my letters. 5 years of silence had not been a choice made by either of us. Someone had quietly erased every attempt we made to find each other. The realization was almost impossible to accept. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully removed a small bundle of folded envelopes secured with a faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed with age, but each envelope remained unopened. "These were all returned to me," he said. Every one was marked with the same notice. "Recipient cannot be located." I slowly removed my own envelope from my jacket and unfolded the map once more. Something slipped free and drifted onto the wooden bench between us. It was a second piece of paper that I had never noticed before because it had been folded tightly inside the map. Alexander picked it up carefully. Across the center, in the same elegant handwriting as the anonymous messages, was a single sentence. "The person who separated you believed they were protecting both of you. Turn the page." He slowly flipped the note over, and both of us froze when we saw the familiar signature waiting on the other side. Alexander and I looked at the signature in complete silence. It belonged to Margaret Holloway, the retired librarian from our hometown, the woman who had introduced us years earlier by recommending the same novel to 2 strangers on the same rainy afternoon. She had always treated us with quiet kindness, remembering our birthdays, setting aside new books she thought we would enjoy, and insisting that every great story deserved a hopeful ending. Neither of us could understand why her name would appear beneath months of anonymous messages. With careful hands, Alexander unfolded the final letter tucked behind the note. The paper had become fragile with age, but the words remained perfectly clear. "Dear Ethan and Alexander, if you are reading this together, then I have finally kept the promise I made many years ago. You deserved the truth long before today, but I believed I was protecting 2 frightened young men from carrying burdens they should never have faced alone." After the accident, Alexander could no longer remember much of his past. At the same time, Ethan believed he had been abandoned. Every letter either of you wrote passed through the library post office because I volunteered there after retiring. When I realized what had happened, I made the terrible mistake of keeping your letters instead of delivering them. I convinced myself that allowing each of you to begin a new life would spare you both years of disappointment. I was wrong. I watched both of you return again and again, each searching in different ways for something neither of you could name. Every Thursday, Alexander came looking for forgotten memories. Every year, Ethan quietly borrowed the same travel book about the Oregon coast. You never truly stopped searching for each other. If you have reached this lighthouse together, then I hope you will forgive an old woman who confused protection with fear. Please choose your own ending now. I lowered the letter, unable to speak. The ocean breeze lifted the corner of the page before Alexander carefully folded it again. There was sadness in his eyes, but no anger, only understanding. She thought she was helping, he said quietly. I nodded. She took away our choice. We stood together beside the weathered bench, watching waves roll endlessly toward the shore. 5 years had disappeared because of one decision made with good intentions and heartbreaking consequences. Yet somehow we had still found our way back to the place where everything began. Alexander reached into his notebook one last time and removed the faded photograph. Without saying a word, he handed it to me. I think it belongs to both of us now, he said with a gentle smile. I looked at the picture, then toward the lighthouse standing against the afternoon sky. The memory was no longer trapped inside faded paper. It was standing beside me. My phone vibrated one final time. Expecting another anonymous instruction, I unlocked the screen. There was no message this time. Instead, every previous text had vanished completely, leaving an empty conversation as though it had never existed. Alexander looked at the display and quietly laughed. Looks like whoever guided us here knew the story was finished. I slipped the phone into my pocket and smiled for the first time in years. The past could never be rewritten, but it no longer controlled what came next. Together we turned away from the cliffs and began walking back along the narrow trail toward the parking area, leaving the lighthouse behind us as the late afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the path ahead with a quiet promise that some endings are simply the beginning of a life that finally finds its way home.